What's going on, guys? Welcome back to the Trance. So today I'm going to be making this beautiful table. This was inspired by the Japanese woodworker Ishitani furniture. I'm going to link the original video that he made on it above here. And when I originally saw it, I just thought it was a really cool design and really beautiful. I knew I wanted to make something similar. So this was inspired by him, but it's my own variation and own design and plans. So it's got some really cool joinery, a lot of hand-cut joinery, and it turned out really beautiful. So I think you guys are going to like it. Let's go ahead and dive into the video. So this project started about a couple years ago when we came across this really unique box elder slab at a local lumberyard. Now, this slab had some really cool figure and grain, as we'll see as the video continues, but it also had a huge crack running down the center, which is something that of course needed to be stabilized. Now, I've been moving away from using epoxy as much in my projects, and so I did want to use Dutchman joints or bow ties to stabilize that crack. Now here I'm making the bow ties at the table saw. Now this is a bit of a tricky cut to make. You want to make sure that you have your workpiece nicely clamped down, but this does work well if you don't have a bandsaw to make nice, even, and symmetric bow ties. So making those two cuts at the table saw then leaves you with a little nub going down the center, and I just bring this over with a chisel and clean that up. I stick to about a 12:1 dovetail ratio for the angle here, as I think it looks really good. So I made these in some pretty thick yellow heart stock. I think the yellow heart's going to contrast the reds in the box elder nicely, and I split them in half with the table saw just to double the amount of bow ties that I get out of that piece. So once I've outlined with a marking knife where the bow tie is going to go, I come in with a trim router and a plunge base and a straight bit in order to clear out the majority of the material, but I make sure I stay about a 32nd of an inch away from the line, as I'll come back through and clean those up with chisels. So one thing I realized when I was chiseling this box elder is that because it's a softer wood, you have to be really careful and take even smaller passes with your chisel, otherwise you risk blowing past that shoulder line or possibly damaging the grain. This was also in a bit of a punky part of the wood, so that definitely didn't help, but you just have to take your time and be very meticulous with it. Once I have it fitting properly, I go ahead and throw a chamfer on the bow tie just to help it seat, and then I can push it into place and hammer it down. The hand plane does a good job of getting it mostly flush with the surface, but I make sure to not go too far and damage any of the surrounding grain, as I'll be running this through a drum sander at the very end of it. Before starting these bow ties, I went through and highlighted in red the areas that I wanted one to kind of get an idea of how many were going to go into place and where I wanted them spaced, and this really helped with the layout. You can see here I'm going for a super clean fit with 0 gaps, and I'm accomplishing that here, and it takes a good amount of time, but it's definitely worth the effort. So I think in all that this table had about 19 bow ties in it, which was a lot of time and a lot of work, but you'll see in the final shots that it turned out really awesome having this many in there, and it really did need it as it had some serious cracks running through it. There were a couple larger voids, and here I did use a little bit of epoxy just to fill those, as I didn't want food or other things getting stuck in them during the table's use. On the edge here, I'm placing a little small guy just on this crack because I don't want that crack to continue propagating and get to the edge of the top, and so it's important to just kind of keep that contained now. That one there is probably about an inch long, so it's a pretty small one. So with the top mostly stabilized and taken care of, I can now turn over to the base, which is definitely the main portion of this project. Now, this is inspired by a build that Ishitani Furniture did a while back, I want to say maybe a year or two ago, and ever since I saw that, I knew I wanted to replicate that base in my own design. And so I thought this would be the perfect opportunity to do this, because this is going to be sort of a sitting and standing bar height table behind a couch in a living room, and so it just seemed like the perfect fit. So After studying his design, I went ahead and sketched and modeled up my own version, replicating the really cool joinery that he does to attach the top and bottom runners, and we'll see that as the video progresses. So I'm going to be using African mahogany as the wood species for the base. I wanted something that was sort of neutral colors, and so that top would stand out because the top has a lot going on, and if you have too much going on in the base in terms of color, I think it's going to detract from the unique character in the top. The first step here is to mark out the mortises. This is going to be to attach the top and bottom runners, and we have more rectangular and then more of these square mortises that we're going to cut out. So as usual, since I don't have any sort of mortising machine, I go ahead and hog out most of the material using a Forstner bit. That's a 64th or 32nd undersized from the final size of the mortise. Once I do that, I can come through and clean it up with hand chisels, just working my way to that shoulder line. And again, you want to be pretty careful here, but at the end of the day, as long as the tenon is strong, you're not actually going to see anything in this joint. So if you do go a slight bit past your line, it's going to be okay. But it's still a good opportunity to work on your chiseling skills. So you have to sort of kind of get in a groove doing this because there's quite a few mortises. I guess there's 4 legs on 3 mortises each, so 12 here that you have to cut out, and each mortise has 4 edges, so that's about 48 edges you have to carefully chisel to the shoulder line. So definitely takes quite a while. It took several hours to do this because I'm very careful with it, and in the end here you get a really good result. Here you can see within about 5 thou of the true dimension of the mortise, so we're spot on. So if you're just getting into hand tool work, I'm going to name a couple of YouTubers that I think really help. They're the people that really taught me everything I know about hand tool work and chiseling technique in general. Those 2 people are going to be Rob Cosman and Matt Eslia. They're both really fantastic people. They've got tons of content here on YouTube, and so if you're just getting into this, I really recommend you check them out. They're going to help you out a ton. A lot of people won't actually keep their workpieces secured with a clamp when they're chiseling. I find that it's really useful to keep things stationary, so I use some holdfasts at the workbench to keep everything down flat. So here we've got the mortises complete, and it feels good to have all those done, and we can move on to the next step. So here I'm cutting out pieces for some of the runners that'll attach the legs on the side. And again, I'm using 8/4 African mahogany as the stock for this, and then I can go ahead and get these ripped to their final width. Then I can start laying out the tenons, and I'm going to be cutting these at the table saw, but it's still really nice to have a shoulder line just to reference and make sure we're cutting these super accurately. So to cut these tenons, what I do is set up a stop block here, and then I make the 4 passes on each face of the piece to get them all at the same depth. I do that on each board, and then I come through and just hog out the waist. And once I've hogged out the majority, I sort of run it back and forth over the blade, as you can see here. This is going to just make your face on the tenon a lot cleaner, and if you're not using a flat ground blade, it's going to take care of any little high spots you have in your cut. So the next step is going to be cutting some of the half laps here, and this is going to be what secures those side runners with the cross beams that connect the 2 sets of legs. So what I'm doing here is carefully laying out these half laps, and these are again going to be cut at the table saw, and we'll be using a very similar technique to how we cut the tenons. I can use a couple setup blocks here just to get the height of the blade dialed in, and even though I don't show it, I always use on joinery cuts a scrap piece just to make sure the height of the blade and the distance is exactly where I want it to be. So I go ahead and cut that with the scrap piece before finalizing and using the actual work pieces. So again, I keep that stop block set up while I make the first and final passes on each board, and once I've done that, I can then move the stop block and come through and cut out all the remaining waste. And with the stop block in place, I can slide it back and get these nice clean half laps. So So I add a chamfer to the ends of the tenons here. This is going to help everything go together smoothly during assembly. And I use a palm router to do the main chamfers on the top. And then I just come through with a sharp chisel to knock down the corners going inward on the tenon, and that's just going to help everything go together nicely. I also use this opportunity while things aren't assembled to come through with a block plane and knock down all the edges of the pieces. I'm not going for an actual chamfer here, I'm just taking a few thou off with the block plane just to make it easier to handle. It's also going to make those corners and edges a little less fragile if they were to get dinged. So now we're moving on to the most difficult part of this project, and the part that I was definitely waiting to do because I was a little bit worried about attempting it, but these are the two large cross beam pieces and the vertical dividers that are going to hold this table up. And the reason I was worried is because this is what's going to feature the really unique hand-cut joinery here. And I don't even know what these joints are called. I just studied Ishitani Furniture's pieces when I was doing this and tried to replicate it as best as I could. Now, I wasn't even sure how I was going to lay these joints out, and so what I ended up doing was using some 3D printed templates from my drawing and from my design in order to print them and use a marking knife to lay them out. Now, I also don't know the name of these joints, and so if anyone's watching this video and knows what this joint is called, definitely leave a comment because I'd be interested to learn the actual name for them. But after marking it out, I go ahead and hog out the majority of the waste with some hand saws, again, staying away from those shoulder lines, and then I'll be coming back through with some sharp chisels to get right up to those shoulder lines. Now, I think one of the most difficult thing about cutting these joints was that you end up with some very thin and very fragile corners, and this was something that I was just having difficulty maintaining and not damaging the wood. So it took a lot of precision and a lot of care to keep these edges and corners intact. So this is the joint or mortise or whatever this thing's called on the bottom beam, and then the top beam, the two triangular pieces or triangular tenons are going to come together to form this trapezoid, which I think is a really, really awesome look, and so that is what we're cutting here. Again, using a pole saw to just hog out the majority of the material, and then I'll come through with a fret saw to remove it, and then come through with the chisels. Between most of the joints, I bring the chisels over and give them a good sharpening because it's really important that things are super sharp in order to get the results we're going for. I used to hand sharpen a lot. I have switched back to using a honing guide quite a bit because I find it really quick to set up, and I just really like having a nice, perfectly even bevel. I still do a mix of hand sharpening and using the honing guide, but I don't think you're at fault either way. Another really tricky thing with these joints are these shallow, acute angles in the corners of the triangles. Of course, a chisel has a bit of thickness to it, so you can't really get in there perfectly. So what I had to do was try to knock it down as much as I could with the chisel, and then I came through later with a little Dremel tool just to hog out the inner material just a bit on the points you wouldn't see on the joint. So now we're switching to the tenons or whatever, again, these joints are called, and these are again using 3D printed templates that came from my design to line these up. Now looking back, I probably would have gone about cutting this joint differently. You'll see here I start by cutting that larger triangle first and then moving to the inner one, and that leaves me with, again, these thin edges that can be really prone to cracking or breaking off. What I would do in the future is start with the smaller triangle, which is just a little mortise, and then at the end chop this triangle off with one cut at the miter saw or table saw in order to give me a really clean edge. So it still turned out really well, but it just meant I had to be extremely careful and take extremely shallow passes with the chisel. So here you can see me sort of digging into that inner acute angle. Again, this is the point that's really hard to get with the chisel, so I just try to do the best I can, but then I can do a test fit and see that these come together. And at this point, I was super excited to see them going together, and without any glue or anything, it was staying up stationary and holding its own weight. So thankfully we made it through cutting the complex joinery with no mistakes, which was pretty miraculous, but here, after doing the half laps on the beams, I did run into a problem. Okay, so you can see we made a bit of a mistake here. I was cutting in the notch here for the half lap on the top beam, and I came to test the half lap joint, and I realized, stupid mistake, this is 1 inch wide, the lower one is 1.25 inches, and I was thinking this was 1.25 inches too, so hence we have this really loose fit. Fortunately, I think there's a pretty easy fix. What I'm going to do is actually just glue a little piece here to add a little thickness back to it, and then cut it to 1 inch again. Won't be the strongest joint because it's just all this end grain here to face grain, but I think it'll be fine. So luckily I didn't cut the other side, so we'll fix this one and keep going. So inherently in these larger scale furniture projects, you're going to make some mistakes here and there. Hopefully they're not major ones. In this case, it was one that I was able to fix pretty easily, and it turned out to be a pretty much invisible seam, so I was really happy with the repair. So to do the repair, I'm just cutting a small strip of the mahogany, and it's going to fit right into place there. And then because it's an end grain to end grain glue job, we need it to clamp really well. And so I'm just cutting a piece of scrap here to be a perfect friction fit, and that's going to act as the clamp. And I'll also use a little wedge just to really firm it into place. Fortunately, due to the nature of this repair, the actual piece that goes into this joint is really going to act as a clamp in and of itself, and so I just need this glued into place, and then I'll flush it up with the hand plane and get it back to the main project. I'm using just a small wedge I had made here. Those are actually offcuts from making the bow ties at the start of the video, and I just hammer those down, again, to increase the clamping pressure a little bit more. Then I can just come through and clean it up with a hand plane, and we can see it's a really clean seam, and this is going to be in a spot you won't even see in the final project. And then I can come through and cut that half lap to the appropriate size. So the effort was worth it. We get a really nice friction fit there, and that's how I like to go for my joints, because it allows you to do a dry assembly without any glue and have your piece still stay together. So I always try to go for a nice friction fit. Something I've started to do a lot more is add leveling feet to the bottoms of the legs for a couple of reasons. The first is to protect the bottom of the wood itself. The second is because pretty much no floor is even, so it's nice to have the ability to adjust the length of these legs in order to give yourself a nice level table. So what I'm doing here is drilling out a cup for the hardware that I bought, and then I'm just using a Forstner bit and a drab point bit in order to drill for the threaded inserts. You can see here I place the threaded insert in place, and then I can put the legs in at the end. So now it's time for final sanding and cleanup before we go ahead and apply a finish before gluing up. So again, I come through with the disc sander and then with the block plane and the hand plane and clean up everything as best I can. And then I apply Mortise oil here. I'm going with the Mortise oil because it's pretty simple to apply. It's going to be a nice finish. It looks really nice, keeps the natural look of the wood, but it's also durable, and for a table base like this, it's going to be plenty strong. I do switch to a polyurethane for the top, as that's going to need more protection, and especially protection from water. I of course leave any glue from going on the mortises or the tenons, as we're going to need the glue to adhere to these areas. And so we're doing the glue up in 4 stages here. 2 are going to be the side leg assemblies. 1 is going to be the center beams with the vertical dividers, and then finally will be the complete glue up. So starting with this smaller one's a lot easier, and these mortise and tenon joints go together really nicely and keep things secure. Once I have them placed, I can come through with some clamps and lock it down. So I go ahead and double check that everything went together nice and square, and checking that, I can then move on to cleaning up the top and bottom beams. So here I'm adding a few decorative chamfers to the part that's going to overhang from the table. That's just going to give it a nice look. And going back here to that repair job, we can see now that everything's sanded, we can see that it really blends in. It's pretty much invisible. So I was really happy with how that turned out. Then I can come through with a block plane and clean up the edges. I'm really careful near the joints, especially those trapezoidal and triangular joints, to make sure I don't damage any of the fragile edges. Finally, it's a bit of hand sanding on the harder to reach spots, and I go ahead and clean up all the chamfers as well, and then we can apply a finish. We can see here it's looking really awesome with the grain popping and with those joints really coming to life. So then I move on to gluing up the top and bottom beams with the diagonal dividers. And this is the part, again, I was kind of worried about because if anything didn't go together well, I risked damaging those fragile edges. Now, fortunately, I had done a dry fit, so I knew things should go pretty smoothly, but it's still stressful, and I do use Titebond Extend just to give me a little bit more working time with gluing the joints together. I make sure to get a nice even glue inside all the faces on these joints, and I'm not too worried about squeeze out as I can come back through and clean that up and sand it down and reapply a bit of finish as needed. The most important thing is that these joints go together strongly. It was really satisfying to tap these into place and see how clean the joinery came out. Now, clamping this was definitely tricky. I didn't really know what the best way was, but I just put these two clamps down the center to kind of push the top and bottom beams together, and this seemed to suffice for giving good clamping pressure and getting the joints together. Now, because there was quite a bit of squeeze out, I did come through and sand down all the joints and then just reapply finish over the top. But here we can see how awesome that joinery turned out and how clean it looks. It's a really unique joint, and I just love how it looks, and I'm super excited about it. Again, if anyone knows the name, be sure to leave that in the comment. I'm curious to know, and I'll definitely be using this joint in the future. And now the most exciting part was putting the three sub-assemblies together. I had some extra hands on deck here because this is a pretty big table and I needed some extra hands to get this put together correctly. But this is just a matter of gluing those half-lap joints and tapping everything into place. And at this point, I was super excited to see the final shape come through. I think that the base looks really amazing and I just love how it looks. So hopefully you guys like it too. So I can now turn my attention back to the top. We had put in all the bow ties and the epoxy to stabilize it, but then I left the top as is while I got the base built and finished. That way if there was any movement or anything that needed cleanup, I could just do it later. So I come through with the draw knife and remove the majority of the bark, and then I come through with the orbital sander and remove everything that's left in the cambium layer and get it down to the wood. Now off camera, I did get it run through a wide belt sander at a local cabinet shop. That's going to get everything nice and flat, and it's something that I wouldn't have been able to do well on my own. And then I can do the standard process of going through the grits. Now I did laser cut a nice emblem that shows my name and my emblem to show that this work was created by me. And I go ahead on the underside on the corner and get that routed out and glued into place. So with the emblem in place, I can just knock it down with a bit of sandpaper and then get on to finishing the top. So again, I'm switching to a polyurethane here. I'm using an armor seal. That's going to give this top a lot of protection, and I build up a good 4 to 5 coats on the top to give it a really good coat and keep it safe from water and other spills. It's really amazing to see the grain come through on this top. Here you can see all the rays and the reds and just the amazing figure that's in this top. It gives it a lot of character. And I think it's really cool how we left that hole empty, as it just adds a lot of uniqueness to this piece. It's also really enjoyable to watch the yellow heart bow ties pop as we come over with the finish. In between the later coats, I knock everything down with an extremely high grit sandpaper just to flatten it and smooth it, and I also clean up some of the edges and knurls on the side. Here I'm just putting on the final coat, and I just left this shot because I think it does a good view of highlighting the rays and the grain on that corner. It's really just a fantastic top and looks really cool. So to attach the top, I'll go ahead and make some shop-made button fasteners, and I'm again using mahogany for this because I have quite a bit of extra from the project. So I run this through the table saw, resawing it by taking 2 passes just to double the yield from this piece. And then I can come through and cut all the buttons out at once just using the crosscut sled. Now I'm going to have a video on this coming up, but the way I like to do this is to make the buttons using the wood, and then I actually make the mortises and the rails on the top of the table using a festool domino. This is a really quick way of doing this and gives me a nice thick tongue for those to sit securely, so I come through with the domino and add those. But with that, I can attach the top and this project is wrapped up. Enjoy the final shots. I couldn't be happier with how this turned out. Be sure to leave a comment what you think, and let's take a look at the table.